In a lawless time when America's western frontier was still being tamed by brave men with steel nerves and quick hands, legends were born from necessity and died by betrayal. The greatest of these forgotten heroes was known simply as Deadeye, a name spoken with reverence by lawmen and whispered in fear by outlaws from Dakota to the Mexican border. Before the railroads connected our great nation, before telephones could carry a man's voice across valleys, William Deadeye Blackwood delivered justice with the precision of a Swiss timepiece and the finality of a gravedigger's shovel. But even the deadliest manhunter who ever wore a marshal's badge couldn't outrun the demons that followed him after the Bismarck massacre of '78. Some said he died that day along with the banker's daughter. Others claimed he simply vanished like morning mist. The truth? Far more extraordinary. For the past 7 years, the man who once put 7 notorious killers in the ground has been hiding in plain sight, crafting intricate watches and grandfather clocks with one hand, while keeping the other on his Remington. But when powerful cattle baron Randall Mitchell decides one clockmaker stands between him and control of Eagle County's precious water rights, the legend of Deadeye is about to be reborn in blood and gunsmoke. Can an aging gunfighter who traded his badge for a clockmaker's loop still stand against the tide of greed and corruption sweeping across the American frontier? Thomas Blackwood woke before dawn, just as he had every morning for the past 7 years. The familiar phantom pain greeted him from his missing right hand, an unwelcome but expected visitor. He massaged the scarred stump where his hand should have been, bearing the discomfort with the quiet stoicism that had become his trademark in Eagle's Ridge. Through the small window of his modest cabin, the first pale light illuminated his sparse living quarters. A single bed, a wooden chest for his few belongings, and a small table where a half-assembled pocket watch lay beside his tools. Another day of precise work and measured solitude awaited him. Another day, he murmured to the empty room, his voice rough from disuse. 7 years of living alone had made conversation feel like a foreign language, though the meticulous work of crafting timepieces suited his temperament perfectly. The precision required kept his mind focused, preventing unwanted memories of gunsmoke and blood from resurfacing. Thomas reached for the carved wooden prosthesis resting on his bedside table. Unlike the crude hooks many amputees wore, his replacement was an elegant mechanism of his own design, a testament to his skill as a craftsman. The prosthesis attached to his wrist with a system of leather straps and buckles, culminating in a smooth, polished wooden hand that couldn't hold a gun but could stabilize a pocket watch, while his left hand worked the delicate gears inside. A trade-off he'd willingly made when he abandoned his former life. After securing the prosthesis, Thomas dressed methodically. Worn denim trousers, a faded blue shirt with the right sleeve carefully altered to accommodate his wooden hand, and a leather vest with pockets precisely sized for his watchmaking tools. His timepiece strapped to his left wrist was a masterpiece of his craft, allowing him to measure intervals with extraordinary precision. As he prepared a simple breakfast of strong coffee and leftover cornbread, he reviewed his order book. Mrs. Wilson's grandfather clock needed cleaning, Judge Parker's pocket watch had a damaged escapement, and 3 new railroad chronometers required final calibration before delivery to the Western Pacific station master. Ordinary work for what Thomas hoped would be an ordinary day. But could even the most precise timekeeper predict when the steady rhythm of his carefully constructed life would be disrupted? What events might unfold to challenge the quiet existence he had built from the ashes of his former self? The distant sound of hoofbeats interrupted Thomas's planning. He paused, coffee cup halfway to his lips, his body instinctively tensing at the unexpected approach. Visitors to his workshop, situated a mile outside of Eagle's Ridge, were rare, especially at this early hour. Most customers came to his shop in town, where he kept regular business hours 3 days a week. Moving to the window with the silent grace that had once been essential to his survival, Thomas observed 3 riders approaching along the narrow trail that led to his cabin. Their posture in the saddle told him immediately that these were not local ranchers or townspeople. They sat their horses with the easy confidence of men accustomed to long days in the saddle, drifters most likely, or perhaps cowboys between jobs. Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly as he noticed how their coats hung open, despite the morning chill, providing easy access to the revolvers holstered at their hips. Not unusual in these parts, but worth noting. By force of habit, his gaze swept the surrounding terrain, mapping lines of sight and potential cover should the situation deteriorate. Old habits, he muttered to himself, catching the instinctive assessment. It had been years since he'd needed to evaluate tactical positioning. Years since Thomas Blackwood the clockmaker had allowed William Deadeye Blackwood, the feared manhunter of the Western Territories, to surface. Thomas stepped onto his porch as the riders approached, his face a careful mask of neutral politeness. The wooden hand remained partially concealed by his position against the doorframe. Another old habit. No need to immediately reveal a potential vulnerability. "Morning, gentlemen," he called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "You're a fair piece from the main road." The lead rider, a weathered man in his 40s with a thick mustache and calculating eyes, reined his horse to a stop at the edge of Thomas's property. His companions, younger men with the hard faces of those who'd seen too much too soon, flanked him slightly behind. "Morning," the leader replied, touching the brim of his hat. "This the Blackwood place? The clockmaker?" Thomas inclined his head slightly. "It is. I'm Blackwood." The leader dismounted with fluid grace, dropping his reins without concern for his horse wandering, a small detail that Thomas noted. The mount was well trained to ground tie, not a common skill for a casual rider's horse. "Name's Victor Ross," the man said, approaching the porch with measured steps. "These are my associates, Quinn and Durham." The younger men remained mounted, their eyes continually scanning the property with poorly disguised interest. "What brings you to my door, Mr. Ross?" Thomas asked, making no move to invite the man onto the porch or into his home. "If you're looking for watch repairs, I keep a shop in town, open Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays." "Sure." Ross stopped at the foot of the porch steps, hooking his thumbs casually in his belt, uncomfortably close to the revolver holstered at his hip. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, we're passing through to Montana territory. Heard in town you might have work. We're skilled with our hands and not afraid of detail work. Thought you might need help with your chronometers." The hesitation before chronometers confirmed what Thomas already suspected. These men knew nothing about timepieces. Town gossip held that Thomas Blackwood occasionally hired assistants when larger orders came in from the railroad, but he'd never actually done so. Someone had deliberately directed these men to his isolated cabin under false pretenses. "I work alone," Thomas replied evenly. "Always have. Whoever told you otherwise was mistaken." But what did these strangers truly want? And how would a seemingly harmless clockmaker with one hand handle men who clearly had something more sinister in mind than seeking honest work? A flash of annoyance crossed Ross's face before his affable mask slipped back into place. "That's so. Fellow in town, Johnson, I believe, at the saloon, seemed convinced you were looking to take on help with a big railroad contract." Thomas knew Walter Johnson well. The barkeep was one of the few people in Eagles Ridge he might call a friend. Johnson would never have sent strangers to his door without warning. "Mr. Johnson must have been confused," Thomas said calmly. "Or perhaps you misunderstood." Quinn snickered, nudging his companion. "Didn't mention he was a cripple, did they, Durham?" Durham grinned, his gaze fixing on Thomas's wooden hand, now visible as he had shifted position. "No wonder he needs help. Can't exactly set those tiny gears with a wooden paw, can he?" Thomas's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. He'd heard such comments before, whispers in town when people thought he couldn't hear, children mimicking his movements when they believed he wasn't looking. Usually he let such remarks slide away without acknowledgement. Today, something about these strangers set his instincts humming like a taut wire. "My hand doesn't hinder my work," Thomas said, his voice taking on a cold precision that would have warned anyone who knew his past. "Nor does it affect my ability to handle unwelcome visitors." The subtle threat wasn't lost on Ross, whose eyes flickered briefly to Thomas's left hand, noting how it had drifted closer to his vest, where a man might conceal a derringer. "Boys," Ross said sharply, "mind your manners. Mr. Blackwood deserves respect." The rebuke seemed sincere, but Thomas had spent too many years reading men's intentions to be deceived. Ross's eyes held calculation, not sincerity. "Since there's no work here," Thomas continued, "I suggest you gentlemen continue on your way. Town's got a decent hotel if you need rest before heading north." Ross studied Thomas for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Appreciate the information. Sorry to have troubled you." He remounted his horse with the same fluid grace, then tipped his hat. "Fine property you've got here, Mr. Blackwood. Real fine." Something in the way he said it, like a man appraising merchandise he intended to purchase, sent a whisper of warning down Thomas's spine. "Good day, gentlemen," Thomas said firmly, making it clear the conversation was over. As the riders turned to leave, Durham glanced back over his shoulder. "Say, clockmaker, how'd you lose the hand anyway? Catch it in some gears?" His companion laughed, but Ross silenced them with a look. Thomas didn't bother to answer. He watched silently as they rode away, waiting until they were specks on the horizon before turning back to his cabin. Inside, he moved directly to his workbench and lifted the false bottom of a drawer, revealing a well-oiled Remington revolver. The familiar weight of the gun in his left hand brought a flood of memories. Some he'd spent years trying to forget. Others he clung to as reminders of why he'd walked away. Thomas checked the action, though he knew the weapon was perfectly maintained. 7 brass cartridges lined up beside it, each one meticulously loaded by his own hand. Despite his disability, old habits died hard, especially those forged in blood and gunsmoke. Would Thomas Blackwood, the quiet clockmaker, be forced to resurrect the deadly skills of his past? And if these men returned with more sinister intentions, could he protect not only his property, but the peaceful life he had struggled so hard to build? 7 years ago, when Thomas Blackwood settled in Eagles Ridge, he'd buried his past along with his real name. The townspeople knew him only as a former cavalry scout who'd lost his hand in a Comanche raid, a partial truth that served his purposes. None knew of his years with the U.S. Marshals or of the 7 notorious outlaws he tracked and eliminated across the Dakota and Montana territories. No one knew that Thomas Blackwood had once been William Deadeye Blackwood, the most feared manhunter in the Western Territories. A man who could draw and fire with his left hand faster than most men could with their right, who could shoot a playing card in half at 30 paces, and who had brought 18 wanted men to justice, most of them in pine boxes. Thomas had left that life behind after a botched assignment had left a hostage dead, a young woman whose face still haunted his dreams. Though the official report had cleared him of wrongdoing, he couldn't forgive himself for failing to save her. He'd resigned his badge, changed his name slightly, and disappeared into the vastness of the frontier with only his revolver and the precision skills that would serve him well in his new profession. For 7 years, Thomas Blackwood had been nothing more than a clockmaker with a missing hand and a talent for mechanical miniatures. The revolver hidden beneath his workbench had been fired only at wolves threatening nearby farms and deer for his dinner table. But as he watched the dust from the strangers' horses settle on the horizon, Thomas felt the stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense for trouble brewing. Those men hadn't come looking for work. They'd come to scout his property, to assess its value and its vulnerabilities. Thomas returned the Remington to its hiding place but kept one cartridge out, rolling it between the fingers of his left hand as he considered his next move. If his instincts were correct, and they rarely failed him, Ross and his companions would return, and their intentions would not be friendly. The question now was whether Thomas Blackwood, the one-handed clockmaker, could handle whatever came, or if Deadeye Blackwood would need to make an appearance after 7 years of retirement. That afternoon, Thomas stood in the doorway of his workshop in town, pocket watch in hand, comparing its steady tick against the tall regulator clock mounted on the wall. 3 days had passed since the unwelcome visitors had appeared at his cabin, and while they hadn't returned, their presence lingered in his thoughts like gunsmoke after a firefight. 2 seconds fast over 24 hours, he murmured, making a minute adjustment with a custom tool gripped between the fingers of his left hand. His prosthetic wooden right hand held the timepiece steady, serving as the perfect workbench for delicate operations. Was time running out for Thomas Blackwood's peaceful existence? And what connections might exist between these mysterious visitors and the powerful forces shaping the future of Eagles Ridge? "Mr. Blackwood," a tentative voice interrupted his concentration. Thomas looked up to see Elizabeth Garrison standing in the doorway, a leather-bound ledger clutched to her chest. At 26, she served as the town's telegraph operator and part-time bookkeeper for several businesses, including Thomas's. Her practical attire and wire-rimmed spectacles gave her a serious appearance that belied the sharp wit he'd come to appreciate during their professional interactions. "Miss Garrison," he acknowledged with a slight nod, "I wasn't expecting you until Friday. The Western Pacific payroll comes through tomorrow," she explained, stepping into the shop. "I wanted to ensure your invoice for the chronometers was prepared correctly. The railroad doesn't tolerate administrative delays." Thomas gestured toward his small office at the back of the shop. "Please." As Elizabeth moved past the cases of timepieces, Thomas noticed her gaze lingering on his wooden hand. Unlike the pity or morbid curiosity he often encountered, her observation seemed more analytical. A familiar tension crept into his shoulders, the instinctive wariness of being studied too closely. "7 minutes," she said suddenly. Thomas paused. "I beg your pardon?" "Your regulator clock," Elizabeth clarified, pointing to the master timepiece. "It's exactly 7 minutes ahead of the railroad standard time. I checked the telegraph time synchronization this morning." Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly. Few people would notice such a discrepancy. Fewer still would mention it directly. "Most clocks in town run at least 15 minutes fast or slow," she continued. "You have a good eye for precision, Miss Garrison," Thomas replied, genuinely impressed. "Or perhaps you intentionally keep your regulator ahead by exactly 7 minutes. She responded with a hint of challenge in her voice. "The same way you always arrive at exactly 7:53 rather than ATU to open your shop." The observation struck uncomfortably close to habits Thomas had maintained for years. Small behaviors designed to keep him from becoming predictable. Predictability got men like him killed in his former life. "I appreciate punctuality," he replied evenly, withdrawing a folder of invoices from his desk. "The railroad chronometers are completed, 24 pieces, each regulated to within 2 seconds per day. The verification certificates are attached." Elizabeth accepted the folder, but her eyes remained on him with that same analytical intensity. "3 men were asking about you at the Frontier Saloon last night." Thomas's fingers stilled momentarily on the desk. "Oh? Rough-looking sorts. Their leader had a distinctive mustache, called himself Ross." She paused. "Did they now?" It wasn't a question. "They were particularly interested in your schedule. When you come to town, when you return to your cabin," Elizabeth continued, adjusting her spectacles. "Walter Johnson fed them false information, but they were persistent." Thomas met her gaze directly. "And why are you telling me this, Miss Garrison?" "Because Walter also mentioned that these men spent considerable time conversing with Randall Mitchell." The name landed like a lead weight. Randall Mitchell, the wealthiest man in Eagle County and owner of the largest cattle operation in the territory. Also the man who had been pressuring smaller ranchers to sell out for the past year, sometimes through questionable means. "I see," Thomas said quietly. "There's more," Elizabeth continued, her voice lowering. "I was processing telegrams yesterday when one came through from Mitchell from Helena. It mentioned a specialist arriving to handle the Blackwood situation if preliminary efforts failed." Thomas's expression remained neutral, though his mind was already calculating implications and contingencies. "You opened a private telegram?" A flush colored Elizabeth's cheeks. "The message came through garbled. I had to request a repeat transmission. It happens occasionally." "Of course," Thomas replied, though the slight curve of his lips suggested he didn't believe her explanation for a moment. "Your concern is noted, Miss Garrison, but I'm simply a clockmaker. What situation could possibly require a specialist?" Elizabeth closed the ledger with a sharp snap. "Mr. Blackwood, I've lived in Eagles Ridge my entire life. I've watched Randall Mitchell systematically acquire every property that stands in the way of his empire. When owners refuse to sell, misfortunes tend to follow. And you believe I'm next on his list? Your property sits atop the only reliable year-round spring between Mitchell's North and South Ranges. He's tried to buy it 3 times in the past year." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "Don't pretend you don't know what's happening." Thomas conceded with a slight nod. "What would you have me do, Miss Garrison? Sell my home to avoid trouble?" "I would have you be careful," she replied firmly, "and perhaps consider that, in Eagles Ridge, you have more allies than you think." What dangers awaited Thomas Blackwood if he chose to stand his ground? And who was this specialist being summoned to handle a simple clockmaker who refused to sell his land? After Elizabeth left, Thomas locked the shop door early, hanging the closed sign despite scheduled hours lasting another 2 hours. Her warning had crystallized suspicions already forming in his mind. If Mitchell was behind Ross's visit, matters were more serious than he'd initially assessed. The walk to Sheriff Davis's office took less than 2 minutes. The lawman was exactly where Thomas expected, feet propped on his desk, hat tipped forward, apparently dozing, but actually observing the street through the window's reflection. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Thomas greeted him, closing the door softly behind him. Davis, a man in his 50s with iron gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the harsh Dakota sun, straightened in his chair. "Blackwood, rare to see you making social calls." "This isn't social," Thomas replied, taking a seat without invitation. "What do you know about 3 riders who came through town recently? Leader calls himself Victor Ross." Davis's expression didn't change, but Thomas noticed the subtle shift in his posture. The lawman was suddenly fully alert. "Why do you ask?" "They paid me a visit, claimed they were looking for work, lied about who sent them." Davis sighed, opening a drawer to withdraw a folded telegram. "I was hoping they'd pass through without causing trouble." He handed the paper to Thomas. "Received this from the sheriff in Bismarck 2 days ago. Seems your visitors have quite a reputation." Thomas unfolded the telegram, scanning its terse contents with practiced efficiency. Ross gang suspected in 3 ranch arsons and 2 murders in North Dakota territory. Witnesses intimidated. No formal charges filed. "Hired muscle," Davis said flatly. "They specialize in convincing reluctant property owners to sell. Work mostly for cattle operations and railroad interests." Thomas refolded the telegram. "And you didn't think to warn me." "I sent Deputy Hayes out to your place yesterday," Davis countered. "You weren't there. Figured I'd catch you next time you were in town." He studied Thomas with shrewd eyes. "Though I'm curious why they'd target you specifically. Your little clock shop doesn't seem like the type of business they'd bother with." "It's not the shop," Thomas replied. "It's my land." Understanding dawned on Davis's face. "The Cottonwood Spring property. Mitchell has been after that water source for years." Thomas nodded. Elizabeth Garrison mentioned a telegram about bringing in a specialist if the preliminary approach failed. Davis's expression darkened. "That suggests Mitchell expected you might resist Ross and his boys." He leaned forward. "What are you not telling me, Blackwood? Most folks would be intimidated by men like the Ross gang showing up at their door. You don't seem concerned. Cautious, yes, but not afraid." Thomas met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "I've encountered their type before." "Have you now?" Davis's tone was carefully neutral. "In your clockmaking days?" "Before that." A charged silence filled the office. For 7 years, Sheriff Davis had respected Thomas's privacy, never pushing for details about his past beyond what Thomas had volunteered upon arrival. Now the older man seemed to be weighing whether that courtesy had reached its limit. "I've been sheriff here going on 17 years, Davis finally said. "Seen all sorts come and go. Most people running from something eventually bring their troubles with them." He tapped a finger thoughtfully on his desk. "But you, Blackwood, you've been different. Kept to yourself, caused no problems, contributed to the community in your way. Never once got the sense you were bringing trouble. More like you were leaving it behind." Thomas remained silent, neither confirming nor denying the assessment. "Here's my concern," Davis continued. "Mitchell has money and influence. If he's hired Ross, he's playing a dangerous game, but still within certain boundaries. A specialist, though?" He shook his head grimly. "That suggests someone with skills beyond simple intimidation. Someone sent to eliminate a problem permanently." "You think Mitchell would risk murder?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not directly. He'd maintain plausible deniability. Tragic accident, robbery gone wrong, something that wouldn't trace back to him." Davis's eyes narrowed. "My advice, sell the property and move on." Thomas stood, adjusting his wooden hand with his left. "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff." "That's not an answer, Blackwood." "No," Thomas agreed. "It isn't." As he turned to leave, Davis spoke again, his voice carrying a new edge of authority. "One more thing. Whatever you're planning, don't. My jurisdiction, my responsibility. Let me handle Mitchell and his hired guns." Thomas paused at the door. "And if they come to your property again, you defend yourself as needed and send for me immediately." Davis continued, his gaze unwavering. But if I find out you went looking for trouble, we'll have problems. Clear? Perfectly, Thomas replied, though both men recognized the deliberate ambiguity in his tone. As storm clouds gathered over Thomas Blackwood's carefully constructed life, would he find the strength to weather what was coming without reverting to the man he once was? Or would the arrival of Mitchell's specialist force his hand and reveal the deadly skills he had spent 7 years trying to forget? Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows down Eagles Ridge's main street. Thomas paused, observing the familiar tableau of the frontier town he'd called home for 7 years. Buckboards and saddle horses lined the hitching rails. The Frontier Saloon was beginning to fill with ranchers and cowhands coming in for evening recreation. The general store was doing brisk business with homesteaders stocking up on supplies. His gaze settled on the Western Union office, where Elizabeth Garrison would be finishing her day's work. Her warning had been unexpected, not just the information, but her willingness to involve herself in what could become a dangerous situation. In 7 years, Thomas had maintained a careful distance from everyone in Eagles Ridge, forming no connections that couldn't be severed at a moment's notice. Yet here was this telegraph operator deliberately intercepting private messages and bringing him information at potential risk to herself. It was inconvenient, complications he didn't need if matters with Mitchell and Ross escalated. Thomas turned toward the livery stable where he kept a horse for trips between town and his cabin. The stable boy, Jamie, was mucking out stalls when Thomas entered. "Evening, Mr. Blackwood," the 14-year-old called cheerfully. "Want me to saddle Kronos for you?" "No need," Thomas replied, reaching for his saddle himself. "I can manage." Jamie watched with ill-disguised fascination as Thomas efficiently saddled the dun gelding, despite his wooden hand. Most people tried to hide their curiosity about how he compensated for his disability. The boy's open interest was almost refreshing. "Mr. Blackwood," Jamie said suddenly, "those men who were asking about you yesterday, they came back this afternoon." Thomas's hands paused on the cinch. "Did they now?" "Yes, sir, but they weren't asking about you this time. They were meeting with someone." "I don't know his name," Jamie replied. Stranger arrived on the afternoon stage from Helena. Fancy dresser with a long coat, even in this heat. Had a strange-looking pistol. Not a revolver, more like those European dueling pistols, but smaller. A derringer, Thomas thought, favored weapon of gamblers and assassins. "The man from Helena," Thomas asked carefully, "did he have a scar here?" He traced a line across his left eyebrow. Jamie's eyes widened. "Yes, sir. You know him?" "We've never met," Thomas replied truthfully. "But I know of him." If the description matched who Thomas suspected, Mitchell had indeed escalated matters considerably. Lucas Hargrove was no common gunman. He was a contract killer who specialized in making murder appear accidental or self-defense. A man who had eluded lawmen across 5 territories, leaving at least 12 bodies in his wake. A man whose method of operation Thomas knew intimately because he had once been assigned to track him down. An assignment interrupted by the hostage situation that ended his career. "Jamie," Thomas said quietly, "could you deliver a message to Miss Garrison at the telegraph office? Tell her I received her package and will be indisposed for the next few days. My shop will remain closed until further notice." "Yes, sir," Jamie replied eagerly. "Anything else?" Thomas considered, then added, "Tell Sheriff Davis the specialist has arrived. He'll understand." As Jamie ran off with the messages, Thomas finished saddling Kronos and led him out the back way, avoiding Main Street. The pieces were falling into place with a dreadful familiarity. Mitchell had sent Ross and his men as the first approach. Intimidation, perhaps arson if necessary. When that failed, he'd summoned Hargrove, a man who left no loose ends and no witnesses. Under normal circumstances, Thomas would have packed his few important possessions and disappeared before dawn. His expertise in disappearing had kept him alive in his former profession and had allowed him to establish his new identity here. Walking away was the logical choice. But as he mounted Kronos and turned toward the trail leading to his cabin, Thomas knew he wouldn't be leaving. Not this time. For 7 years, he had deliberately avoided conflict, submerging the man he had been beneath the quiet craftsman he had become. 7 years of looking away when powerful men like Mitchell bullied and threatened those weaker than themselves. 7 years of pretending that William Deadeye Blackwood was dead and buried. As the sun descended toward the horizon, casting his shadow long across the trail ahead, Thomas made his decision. He wouldn't run from Lucas Hargrove. Instead, for the first time in 7 years, he would prepare to meet an adversary on his own terms, with precision, timing, and if necessary, lethal force. Deadeye was about to emerge from retirement, and Lucas Hargrove was about to discover why Thomas had earned that name long before he ever crafted his first chronometer. Would Thomas Blackwood's skills still prove razor-sharp after 7 years of disuse? And what price would he pay for returning to the deadly profession he had struggled so hard to leave behind? Thomas sat motionless in the darkness of his cabin, listening to the night sounds outside. The chorus of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the gentle rustling of cottonwood leaves in the breeze. But his attention was focused on detecting any disruption to this natural symphony, any indication that men were approaching his property under cover of darkness. The cabin was dark, save for a single lantern burning low on the table, casting long shadows across the room's interior. To anyone watching from outside, it would appear that the clockmaker had retired early, perhaps reading by lamplight before sleep. A predictable routine for a predictable man. But the Thomas Blackwood of 7 years ago would never have been so predictable. He had spent the hours since returning from town preparing for what might come. The Remington revolver now sat cleaned and loaded on the table before him, alongside a small case containing the specialized tools of a trade he had abandoned years ago. From a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard, he had retrieved items that Thomas Blackwood, clockmaker, had no business possessing. A telescopic sight that could be mounted on a rifle, several small vials of chemicals, specialized ammunition, and a worn leather-bound notebook containing diagrams, distances, and notations in a cipher of his own creation. Most tellingly, he had removed the wooden hand that had become his public identity. In its place, he had attached something few knew existed, a mechanical prosthesis far more sophisticated than his everyday wooden appendage. This device, crafted during long winter nights when memories kept him from sleep, featured articulated metal fingers controlled by subtle movements of his forearm muscles. It couldn't match the dexterity of a natural hand, but it had been designed with one specific purpose in mind: to stabilize a revolver while his left hand cocked and fired, a tool created for a contingency he had prayed would never arise. The soft scrape of boot leather against stone, nearly imperceptible but unmistakable to trained ears, broke the natural rhythm of night sounds. Thomas remained motionless, only his eyes shifting toward the direction of the noise. The approach was from the west, using the shadow of the cottonwood grove for cover, a professional's choice, avoiding the open ground around the cabin. A second noise, this time from the opposite direction, the gentle creak of saddle leather as someone dismounted. They were coordinating a two-directional approach, standard procedure for professionals expecting resistance. Thomas extinguished the lantern with a quick breath, plunging the cabin into darkness. His eyes, already adjusted to the dim light, could make out the shapes of furniture and doorways. More importantly, the thin shafts of moonlight penetrating through small gaps in the window coverings provided just enough illumination to create navigational markers. He moved silently to a predetermined position behind the large oak cabinet that held his clockmaking tools, a space just wide enough for a man to stand unseen from both the door and windows. In the darkness, he removed a small object from his vest pocket, a modified pocket watch. But instead of telling time, this device served a very different purpose. At precisely midnight, a time he knew because his internal clock, honed by years of precision timing, never failed him. Thomas pressed the stem of the watch. A series of small mechanical clicks emanated from various points around the cabin's exterior, so faint they would be indistinguishable from insect sounds to the untrained ear. What followed was silence, a sudden, complete absence of movement. Outside, the intruders had heard something, perhaps felt the subtle change in atmosphere that accompanied activated mechanisms and frozen in place. Uncertain. 10 seconds passed. 20. Then the cautious advance resumed, now with heightened wariness. Thomas allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Phase 1 complete. The perimeter alerts had functioned as designed and, more importantly, had put the intruders on edge. Men who were nervous made mistakes. Men who were nervous and trying to maintain stealth made even more. Through the window to his right, Thomas caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure moving toward the front door. The man's outline was bulky, suggesting Durham or Quinn from Ross's gang. No sign yet of Lucas Hargrove. The specialist would be hanging back, watching, evaluating, looking for signs of preparation or ambush. It was what Thomas himself would have done in a similar situation. A soft metallic scrape at the door lock confirmed they were attempting entry. Thomas remained motionless, counting silently in his head. In precisely 12 seconds, the lock would yield to their picking tools. 5 seconds after that, the door would open, and the first man would enter, staying low, weapon drawn. At the 10-second mark, Thomas gently depressed a small lever concealed in the floorboard with his boot heel. The lock clicked open on schedule. The door began to swing inward. As predicted, a figure entered in a crouch, the moonlight glinting off the barrel of a revolver in his hand. "It's clear," the intruder whispered hoarsely. "Looks like he's—" His words ended abruptly as the tripwire Thomas had activated caught the man at ankle height. It wasn't designed to injure, merely to unbalance, which it did with perfect precision. The intruder pitched forward, instinctively throwing out his hands to break his fall. In the same instant, Thomas emerged from his hiding place, moving with the fluid grace of a man who had rehearsed this exact scenario repeatedly. The Remington revolver in his left hand spoke once, the sound deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck not the fallen intruder, but the oil lamp hanging directly above him. Glass shattered, kerosene sprayed, and the second intruder, now silhouetted in the doorway, became a perfect target against the night sky behind him. Thomas's second shot caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him backward out of the cabin with a cry of pain. "Quinn's hit!" the fallen man shouted, scrambling to regain his footing in the darkness. "It's a trap!" Thomas was already moving to his secondary position, diving behind the heavy oak table he had strategically repositioned earlier that evening. The fallen lamp had ignited a small controlled fire precisely where Thomas had intended, illuminating the doorway while leaving his position in shadow. A barrage of gunfire erupted from outside, bullets splintering the cabin walls and shattering the remaining windows. Thomas remained motionless, counting shots, 3 revolvers firing. Ross and his 2 men accounted for, but no precise single shots from a Derringer. Hargrove was still holding back, observing. When the initial fusillade ended, Thomas called out in a voice pitched to Carey, "You're trespassing on private property, gentlemen. The sheriff has been notified. I suggest you collect your wounded and leave while you still can." "You shot my brother, you one-handed freak," came the enraged reply. Durham's voice confirming Quinn was the man Thomas had wounded. "He'll live," Thomas replied calmly. "The bullet passed clean through his shoulder, but the next one goes through something more vital if you don't withdraw immediately." A cold laugh came from the darkness beyond the doorway. Not Durham or the fallen man inside, but a new voice, Ross. "Mighty confident for a clockmaker," Ross called. "Though I'm starting to think there's more to you than tiny gears and springs, Blackwood. Or should I call you by another name?" The question sent a chill through Thomas. Did they know his real identity? Had Hargrove somehow recognized him from his former life? "The only name that matters is Randall Mitchell," Thomas replied, shifting focus. "The man who sent you to intimidate me off my land." "Business is business," Ross answered with a shrug in his voice. "Nothing personal, but you've complicated matters by putting a bullet in Quinn. That makes it personal for Durham here." "Then I suggest Mr. Mitchell compensate you appropriately for your trouble," Thomas countered, "because you won't be getting my land. Not tonight, not ever." During this exchange, Thomas had been calculating angles and distances in his head. The fallen intruder inside the cabin had used the distraction to crawl behind a storage chest, his revolver now trained in Thomas's general direction, though the man couldn't quite see him in the shadows. The fire from the broken lamp was spreading, not dangerously yet, but enough to gradually illuminate more of the cabin's interior. Thomas had perhaps 2 minutes before his position would be exposed. "I admire your spirit, Blackwood," Ross called, his voice taking on a more menacing tone. "But you're outmatched. 1 man with 1 hand against 4 experienced gunmen. The odds don't favor you." Thomas's response was not in words but action. In one fluid motion, he raised the Remington and fired twice in rapid succession. The first bullet struck the fallen lamp's metal base, sending it skittering across the floor directly toward the hidden intruder. The second shot hit the chest the man was hiding behind, splintering wood mere inches from his head. The intruder broke, scrambling toward the door in panic, firing wildly as he went. Thomas let him go. One less threat inside was one less angle to cover. 3 gunmen now, Thomas corrected calmly. And you seem to be laboring under a misapprehension about my missing hand being a disadvantage. As if to emphasize his point, Thomas used his mechanical prosthesis to withdraw a small object from his vest, a compact mirror attached to a telescoping rod. With practiced ease, he extended the rod and positioned the mirror to provide a view of the area outside the shattered window while remaining in cover. The reflection showed Ross and Durham crouched behind the water trough, with Quinn lying behind them, clutching his bleeding shoulder. But more concerning was what he didn't see. No sign of Lucas Hargrove. The specialist had either remained at an extreme distance or, more likely, was circling to find another angle of attack. Thomas knew he needed to change the dynamics of this confrontation quickly. The fire was spreading, and while he had planned for this possibility, positioning his most valuable possessions and documents in a metal chest that could withstand the flames, the growing blaze would soon force movement. "Last warning, Ross," Thomas called out. "Take your men and leave. Tell Mitchell that his specialist won't fare any better than you have." A momentary silence followed. Then Ross's voice came back, tinged with genuine surprise. "You know about Hargrove?" "I know more than you think," Thomas replied. "I know he's killed 12 men across 5 territories. I know he prefers a twin-barrel Derringer with custom-made ammunition, and I know he's not out there with you right now, which means he's trying to circle behind me." The silence that followed told Thomas his assessment had hit home. Ross had not expected this level of knowledge from a supposed clockmaker. Would Thomas's carefully laid plans be enough to counter both Ross's gang and the deadly precision of the specialist Hargrove? And what price would he pay for returning to the violent world he had left behind 7 years ago? Thomas used the momentary advantage to implement the next phase of his plan. With quick, efficient movements, he reached up to the ceiling beam above him and retrieved a small cloth pouch he had positioned there earlier. Opening it revealed several small glass vials and a mechanical contraption that resembled a miniature clockwork mechanism. "What Mitchell didn't tell you," Thomas continued, working with his left hand while he spoke, "is that I specialized in precision timing long before I started making clocks." He attached the mechanism to one of the vials and set it on the floor, then began a deliberate movement toward the rear wall of the cabin, where a concealed exit awaited, a modification he had made years ago out of old habits he couldn't break. "In approximately 30 seconds, Thomas said, his voice still carrying the same calm precision, "a mixture of chemicals will create a reaction that produces a thick, acrid smoke. Not harmful, but extremely disorienting. It will pour out these broken windows and provide excellent cover. For me, not for you, since I know exactly when and where it will deploy." "He's bluffing," Durham growled outside. "Maybe," Ross replied, though doubt had crept into his voice. "Either way, he can't escape a burning cabin without exposing himself." Thomas had reached the rear wall now, where a section of apparently solid logs could be pivoted outward to create an opening just large enough for a man to squeeze through. As he prepared to make his exit, the mechanism he had set in motion clicked into action. The vial cracked, chemicals mixed, and within seconds a dense white smoke began billowing through the cabin, pouring out the broken windows toward Ross and his men. Coughing and cursing erupted outside as the smoke enveloped their position. Thomas slipped through his escape hatch, emerging into the cool night air on the opposite side of the cabin from where Ross and his men were positioned. But as he straightened, instinct made him drop immediately back to a crouch. The whisper of disturbed air was his only warning as a bullet passed through the space where his head had been a fraction of a second earlier. "Impressive escape route, Deadeye," came a soft, cultured voice from the darkness to his left, "though I expected nothing less from the man who nearly caught me in Bismarck 7 years ago." Lucas Hargrove, and he knew exactly who Thomas was. "You have the advantage on me, Mr. Hargrove," Thomas replied, keeping his voice steady while his eyes searched the darkness for any sign of the assassin's position. "I don't recall us being formally introduced." A low chuckle emanated from the shadows. "We weren't, but I make it my business to know who's hunting me. You were quite the topic of conversation among my kind, the one-handed marshal who never missed a shot, until that unfortunate business with the banker's daughter. The mention of the hostage situation that had ended his career sent a spike of cold anger through Thomas's chest. You seem well informed for someone who spent his life running. Professional courtesy, Hargrove replied, though I admit I never expected to find you here playing at being a clockmaker. Does Mitchell know who he's actually targeted? Unlikely, Thomas said, gradually shifting position as he spoke, trying to pinpoint Hargrove's location by sound. He's just a greedy rancher who wants my water rights. Pity! Hargrove's voice seemed to come from a slightly different direction now. He was moving too, circling like a predator. When he hired me to eliminate a troublesome clockmaker, I had no idea I'd be facing the legendary Deadeye. It adds a certain professional satisfaction to the assignment. Thomas's prosthetic hand moved slightly, adjusting the grip on his Remington. I'm retired, Hargrove. Have been for 7 years. Yet here you stand, gun in hand, having just outmaneuvered 3 hired guns. Old habits, Deadeye. A subtle metallic click, the sound of a derringer's hammer being pulled back, came from approximately 15 feet to Thomas's right, behind the woodpile. In that instant, Thomas calculated trajectory, angle, and timing, just as he had done countless times in his former life. The Remington in his left hand swung up and fired in one smooth motion. The bullet struck not Hargrove, but the woodpile itself, sending splinters and logs cascading in the direction of the sound. The distraction was minimal, but for an operation measured in fractions of seconds, it was enough. Thomas lunged sideways as Hargrove's derringer discharged, the bullet grazing his left shoulder instead of finding his heart. Thomas's second shot followed immediately, guided more by instinct and muscle memory than visual targeting. A sharp intake of breath from the darkness told him the bullet had found some mark, though likely not a fatal one. First blood to you, Deadeye, Hargrove acknowledged, his voice now tight with pain. It's been years since anyone managed that. Thomas didn't respond, instead using the momentary advantage to change position again, moving toward the corner of the cabin where the growing firelight wouldn't silhouette him. Your reputation wasn't exaggerated, Hargrove continued, also moving. The subtle sounds of his passage were barely perceptible even to Thomas's trained ears. But I wonder, have 7 years of crafting trinkets dulled your edge? The William Blackwood I studied would have made that shot count. Perhaps, Thomas conceded, reloading the spent chambers in his Remington with practiced efficiency, despite using only one hand in his prosthesis. Or perhaps I'm not aiming to kill you, Hargrove. A skeptical laugh answered him. Noble sentiment, but we both know better. In our profession, it's kill or be killed. I left that profession behind. Did you? The elaborate preparations suggest otherwise. The traps, the escape route, the smoke device, these aren't the improvisations of a clockmaker defending his home. They're the calculated contingencies of a manhunter expecting trouble. The assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Thomas had indeed prepared his cabin for this possibility from the day he purchased it, adding defensible features and escape options that no ordinary citizen would consider necessary. Even as he embraced his new identity, some part of him had never fully believed he could escape his past. Old habits, Thomas acknowledged, echoing Hargrove's earlier observation. Indeed, which makes me wonder why a man with your skills would hide in this backwater, making watches and repairing grandfather clocks when you could have written your own ticket with any number of employers who value such talents. Because I've seen where that path leads, Hargrove, Thomas replied genuinely. To men like you, men who sell their skills to the highest bidder with no regard for justice or innocent lives. The cabin's roof was fully engulfed in flames now, illuminating the yard in flickering orange light that created shifting shadows. Perfect concealment for 2 men engaged in a lethal game of cat and mouse. Justice? Hargrove sounded amused. Was it justice when you put a bullet through Donovan Gray in Deadwood? Or when you tracked the Gibson brothers for 3 weeks before gunning them down at their camp? Your badge didn't make you different from me, Deadeye. It just made you sanctioned. Thomas remained silent, unwilling to engage in the moral equivalence Hargrove was attempting to draw. Instead, he focused on the tactical situation. Ross and his remaining men had fallen suspiciously quiet on the other side of the burning cabin. Either they had retreated in the face of the fire and smoke, or they were repositioning for another assault. The sound of approaching hoofbeats added a new complication. Riders coming fast from the direction of town. Sheriff Davis, perhaps, responding to the gunfire, invisible flames, or reinforcements sent by Mitchell. "It seems our private duel is about to be interrupted," Hargrove observed, having also heard the approaching riders. "A pity, I was enjoying this reunion." "Surrender now, Hargrove," Thomas called. "Face justice for the lives you've taken." Another low laugh answered him. "Another time, perhaps, Deadeye. Mitchell isn't paying me enough to face both you and the local law. But don't worry, our business remains unfinished. I never leave a contract incomplete." Before Thomas could respond, a series of rapid gunshots erupted from the far side of the cabin. Ross and his men providing covering fire as Hargrove made his escape. Thomas caught a glimpse of movement as a figure darted toward the cottonwood grove where horses would be tethered. He raised his Remington, tracking the movement, finger tightening on the trigger. For a heartbeat, he had Hargrove squarely in his sights, a killing shot at a range well within his capabilities, even in the uncertain light. But he hesitated. 7 years ago, William Deadeye Blackwood would have taken that shot without a second thought, ending Lucas Hargrove's murderous career with a single bullet. But the man who raised the Remington now was caught between two identities: the relentless manhunter he had been and the clockmaker he had become, a man who understood all too well the weight of taking a life. In that moment of hesitation, Hargrove vanished into the shadows of the grove. The approaching riders crested the hill, Sheriff Davis at the lead, followed by his deputy and several armed townsmen. They drew up short at the sight of the burning cabin and Thomas standing in the yard, Remington still raised toward the cottonwood grove. "Blackwood?" Davis called, dismounting quickly. "What in God's name happened here?" Thomas lowered his weapon slowly, watching as Ross and his remaining men fled in the opposite direction, taking advantage of the diversion. They would be long gone before Davis could organize a pursuit. "Mitchell sent men to drive me off my land," Thomas replied simply, holstering the Remington. "They set fire to my cabin when I refused to leave." Davis's gaze moved from the burning structure to Thomas's face, then to the mechanical prosthesis that had replaced his familiar wooden hand. His eyes narrowed with the look of a man seeing puzzle pieces fall into place. "Just like that?" the sheriff asked skeptically. "4 against 1, and you're standing here without a scratch while they're running for the hills?" "I got lucky," Thomas replied, the same answer he had given to similar questions for years. Davis dismounted, approaching Thomas with a measuring gaze. "That was more than luck, Blackwood. No clockmaker holds off 4 professional gunmen. Who are you, really?" Before Thomas could formulate a response, Elizabeth Garrison pushed through the gathered men, her normally neat appearance disheveled from the hard ride. "Mr. Blackwood," she called, dismounting awkwardly, clearly not an experienced rider. "Thank goodness you're alive. When we saw the flames from town, I feared the worst." She stopped short upon seeing his mechanical prosthesis, her eyes widening in surprise. That's not your usual—" "Miss Garrison," Thomas acknowledged with a nod, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "You shouldn't have come. It's not safe." "Clearly," she replied, gesturing to the burning cabin. Her eyes moved to his left shoulder, where blood darkened his shirt from where Hargrove's bullet had grazed him. "You're wounded." "It's nothing," Thomas insisted, though in truth, the adrenaline was beginning to fade, making the injury more noticeable. Sheriff Ross and his men fled west. Hargrove went north through the cottonwoods. "If you hurry, you might catch one group." "Hargrove?" Davis's expression darkened. "Lucas Hargrove was here?" "Mitchell's specialist," Thomas confirmed. "He won't stay. You won't catch him. He still has a contract to fulfill." Davis gestured to his deputy and several of the townsmen. "Hayes, take 4 men and head west after Ross. The rest of you search the cottonwood grove. I doubt you'll find Hargrove, but look anyway." As the men dispersed to follow orders, Davis turned back to Thomas, his expression grave. "You and I need to have a long overdue conversation, Blackwood, or whatever your real name is." Thomas met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "Yes, I suppose we do." As they stood in the flickering light of the burning cabin, Thomas's home and livelihood reduced to embers, he knew that one chapter of his life had ended. The peaceful existence he had constructed so carefully was gone, consumed by flames and gunsmoke. The question now was, what would rise from those ashes? Thomas Blackwood, the clockmaker with a mysterious past, or William Deadeye Blackwood, the manhunter whose legend had pursued him despite his best efforts to escape it? And as Elizabeth Garrison moved to his side, her presence a reminder of connections he had tried so hard to avoid forming, Thomas realized that the choice might not be entirely his to make. As Thomas Blackwood stood amid the ashes of his former life, would he find the strength to forge a new identity that embraced both his past and his present? And could a man who had spent 7 years running from who he truly was finally find peace by accepting all parts of himself? The clockmaker and the gunslinger, the craftsman and the hunter, the solitary wanderer, and the man who had, despite his best efforts, become part of a community? As dawn broke over Eagle's Ridge, Thomas Blackwood stood among the charred remains of his cabin, his past and present no longer separated by the fragile wall of deception he'd built. The town now knew the truth. Their humble clockmaker carried the deadly skills of the legendary Deadeye. But rather than drive them away, the revelation had drawn them closer. Elizabeth Garrison's hand found his as they surveyed what remained of his solitary life. "You once told me precision was everything in watchmaking," she said softly. "Perhaps the same is true for living. It's not about keeping your past and present precisely separated, but about bringing them into perfect alignment." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of his Remington at his hip, no longer hidden, but worn openly for the first time in 7 years. Sheriff Davis approached, extending a silver star. "This town needs more than just your watches keeping time, Blackwood," he said. "It needs a man who understands that justice, like a fine timepiece, requires both strength and delicacy." As Thomas accepted the deputy's badge, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a shard of broken glass. Not the haunted manhunter who fled Bismarck, nor the reclusive clockmaker who hid from his past, but something new. A man who had finally found his proper place in the world's grand mechanism. "This isn't over," Thomas said, thinking of Hargrove and Mitchell. "Some men only understand one language." "Then we'll speak it together," Elizabeth replied with unexpected steel in her voice. For 7 years, Thomas Blackwood had measured his life in seconds and minutes. Now, surrounded by friends instead of ghosts, he looked to the future not with dread, but anticipation. The Deadeye legend would continue, but this time he wouldn't stand alone.